I hope you can all see the screen. So I am a linguist by training, and I've spent a good part of my academic career researching languages. But in recent years, I've found myself increasingly in position of what people like to call academic leadership. And through those positions, I have started dealing with aspects of academia that have to do with money and budgets and societal wishes and societal perceptions of what we do. And because I fundamentally have always seen myself as deeply down a humanist, I've always spent quite a lot of time reflecting on what we do, what we are able to achieve, and what we could be doing. And one of the things that has really interested me for a number of years is these alleged crises of the humanities, which for me, if we believe in it, is really a crisis of humanity altogether, because as I'm going to tell you here, I believe that these two things are connected. And so when I think about it, I actually think pretty much of not just the humanities, but the arts and the social sciences as a broad field of disciplines and engagements that all, for better or worse, in recent years seem to have faced a series of challenges. So before actually telling you that there is such a crisis, what I like to do is always question that very proposition. And so the question is there a crisis of the humanities? And by the way, if at any point in time you lose audio or video, please let me know immediately or drop a chat line to the organizers so that I know that I have to do something with my connection. Yeah. So let's think about our own immediate world of academia. Let's think of the number of faculty positions that we are able to leverage in support of the humanities, arts, and social sciences. Let's think about the postgraduate research places, the research facilities, the type of income that we are able to generate from industry or from government, and perhaps for me, most importantly, the type of impact that our work has on society. Do we see these as strong trends, growing trends, trends that give us confidence in what we do? Or do we see these as struggles, as aspects of our work that are endangered? In my line of work, in the country where I lived and in the countries where I've worked, by and large, it is the latter. There is decreased funding, there are decreased position, there is decreased interest. And this can be explained in a number of ways, and I want to explore a few of these. But perhaps beyond our narrow world of academia, there is another aspect of society that we can look at to ask ourselves whether there is a crisis of humanities or not. And that is the world itself. And when we look at the world itself, we see racism and intolerance. We see nationalism on the rise. We see democracy in decline. We see rampant neoliberalism, increasing localization, decline of welfare states, post-truth society. These to me are all serious indication that there is a certain failure in the mission of humanity in terms of emancipation. And I have a hard time thinking that part of that failure, not entirely, but part of that failure lies within what the humanities do and what they could be doing in society. I understand that this is a challenging proposition, and I will first and foremost challenge my own discipline to show you that I mean this seriously and that I am prepared to self-reflect on it. So let's consider what could be wrong. We could say that our important research does not have sufficient impact. Or we could say that our important research does not reach out to the public. We could think that our research is perhaps not important, or that our research is not solution-oriented, or perhaps it's not so easily applicable, or perhaps you can hear people say that we should really play a role as educator, but not so much as researchers. You could think that it's not really our fault. University enters the game too late. By that point, minds are shaped through schooling and society, and there is very little we can do. Or you could think that nothing is wrong, that this is just how the world is, and that there is nothing that we can do about it. Now, I don't have enough time to ask the 30 plus of you which ones of these you think are right or wrong, but I will tell you one thing. I believe that only one of these, to me, is not really acceptable, and all the other ones have some truth. The one that is not acceptable is the last one, the one that says nothing is wrong. In all the other ones, I think there is some truth. And I will now proceed to tell you why. First, I want to revisit one of these answers, and that is the role that humanities and social sciences can have in education, even in higher education at university. Now, I don't mean to say that all that we are good for is to educate people, but there is no significant research that we can produce. I don't mean to say that at all. But what I mean to say is that actually there is an extremely significant role that we can play in education that we don't always play. And for that, I want to take you through an experience that I had when I was at the University of Hong Kong, and when we developed what we call the Common Core Curriculum. Common Core Curriculum was developed in Hong Kong in the past decade over a period of 3 to 5 years. And it aimed at putting at the center of higher education the ability of students who graduated from our university to engage with the fundamental issues that we felt society was facing. The idea was that all these issues were so complex that they had to be tackled primarily in interdisciplinary means, so going beyond disciplines, going beyond faculties. And the idea was that each student in their first 2 years would complete at least 6 of these courses across 4 different areas. And you see the areas here: the humanities, global issues, technological literacy, and China. And over a period of 3 years, we developed 200 plus courses addressing issues such as death and poverty and artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. And all these issues were necessarily tackled by a multitude of scholars and lecturers from very different faculties and disciplines. But what was interesting was the outcome of this, because just almost by natural selection, what ended up to be the case was that for over 50% of these courses, there was a very heavy involvement of scholars from the humanities, the arts, and the social sciences. So that across the whole university, a lot of the type of teaching and research that we did in these faculties became much more visible over a few years and reached pretty much every single student, no matter whether they were training as engineers, doctors, social scientists, or what have you. And in a sense, that became also a good place where to fill a certain gap in the knowledge of liberal arts that students coming from school might have. So that for me was a very positive exercise, and I mention it here because I would like to put forward the notion that engaging deeply in teaching and learning is not necessarily downgrading our disciplines, but quite the contrary, it can give our disciplines, both in terms of teaching as well as research, an upgrade, an uplift, and the visibility that is much needed. But so what about research? Because we are academics, we are scholars, we are researchers, and we should be. What causes this ominous crisis of humanities research? One way in which I like to think about crisis is in terms of depression. And depression, according to some at least, arises primarily through disconnecting from meaningful engagements. And this goes back to the importance of connection. Depression can be caused by disconnecting from meaningful things, meaningful people, as well as meaningful accomplishments that make us seen, make us visible, give us status. And I think that in one way or another, the humanities at times, and perhaps sometimes quite often, suffer from one or two of or all of these disconnections. In a number of academic contexts, such as the UK and even here in Australia, for the better or worse, the notion of engagement has really become very important in recent years. And I know that a lot of us hate engagement, that when it's being mentioned to us by some managerial person inside the university who has never written a scholarly paper or never done a piece of research. And I agree with that. But there is a good meaning of engagement. When I think about research with engagement, I think about research that A, makes a direct contribution to human society. B, a research that is actually designed with community and not imposed on community. A research that asks communities questions such as, what would be your interest in this, and how can I bring my expertise to serve your interest? And C, a research that impacts on humanity, on culture, on politics, meaning a research that is visible, that is heard, that people have to pay attention to, that they cannot ignore. I think that these three types of engagements, these three types of connections can be very good cures to the kind of depression that we might experience at times in the humanities. In a sense, this requires a shift of mindset for some of us. It has certainly required that in my own case, and I will soon give you concrete examples. Many of us in our past have been used to thinking about our preferences, our likes, our tastes. We have been used to worry about the narrowness of our field and how to achieve excellence within that specific field. But if we do really worry about how we can impact society for better good, if we want to make a difference, I think there are other things that might be worth thinking about. We should start thinking about what might a given community, society, region experience that is problematic. Meaning, we need to connect. We need to connect to communities and societies. We can ask ourselves, what I know, how can that help someone else be in a better position? We have to leverage on what we know. We have to team up, not just with community, as I just said, but with others who know things that we don't know, so that we can make a more comprehensive solution to a complex problem. And we need to ask ourselves how we reach society and how we reach the people that have agency in bringing about change. We need to plan what we're going to put out there, because not everything is read by everyone. My background is the one of, first of all, a student of Chinese language and literature at Ca' Foscari, as Anna said. And then I went on to study linguistic typology, a comparativist approach to languages. From there, I moved on to Creole studies, to work in language contact. And there in particular, I became quite involved in a series of arguments and theories and debates surrounding what the field likes to call Creole exceptionalism. And I won't bother you with the details of that. But it basically asks questions about the ideology of theories and whether certain theories have innate cultural and racial biases that permeate the kind of methods and the kind of findings that are being used. And you would think that something like this might actually be something of a certain societal interest that might go beyond the narrow field of a certain linguistic perspective. But I must say that 30 years later, then this debate was generated, and after hundreds and hundreds of publications on the topic, when you look out there in society, when you look out there in public sources, when you look out there in the general debate, you see that very little of whatever has been said across this period of time has actually reached a number of different audiences. And that made me think quite seriously about what I was doing and what I wanted to eventually end up doing. As it often happened, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes by talking to people very different than me, and partly through a PhD supervision that I had, at some point in time, I became increasingly worried and interested in the issue of nationalism. This was partly due to the fact that we lived through years where nationalism was on a rise. We thought we had seen the death of nationhood, and we saw very nice books written about it. But then all of a sudden, it came back to bite us. And because that topic preoccupied me, and because I wanted to have an opportunity to say something about it, I asked myself the very question that I introduced to you before. I asked myself, how can I, as a linguist, find a meaningful way to contribute to understanding and debating issues of nationalism? That brought me to looking into the issue of linguistic discrimination, and that then became a research project on threatening languages. Now, threatening languages is a term that I use because it's ambivalent, and it actually indicates two things that are very interesting and relevant about language today. One is the very fact that languages are under threat. Those of you who have some familiarity with the literature on language endangerment will know that linguists like to talk about the fact that 50% or so of languages spoken today are likely to be out of use in the next 50 years, that out of 7,000 languages spoken 50 years ago, there are about 3,500 around maybe that are really vital, and everything else is endangered. And obviously this is a really important issue for humanity. Not just for linguistics, and that's what makes it interesting to me. It's part of a bigger picture of a diversity that is decreasing in many, many ways. It is part of intangible heritage that we try to preserve. It is part of social justice, disempowerment, marginalization. And one of the possible things that we can do about it is an active response in terms of trying to document and preserve it, which is where linguistics come in. But there is a very different, in fact, pretty much opposite interpretation of threatening languages. And that is when language is actually instrumentalized and used as a tool for discrimination. And while in the former part of the last 10 years, I engaged very much in the former interpretation, that of language endangerment and revitalizing languages. In the last few years, I've been really interested in the language as weapon issue within the context of how language is instrumentalized in nationalist enterprises. I now zoom in on one specific illustration of how that happens to give you the gist of this kind of research. I now go back to the 1950s and Sri Lanka. I am sure that some of you are very familiar with this, and I'm also quite sure that others aren't, so bear with me while I give a bit of background. In the 1950s, Sri Lanka gains independence from British colonial rule. And at that point in time, it's quite a pluralist society with a majority of Sinhalese-speaking people, a dominant minority of Sri Lankan Tamils, a less influential minority of Indian Tamil people, and then various other people. In terms of languages, there is one majority language, which is Sinhala, which is an Indo-Aryan language. And then there is the Sri Lankan Tamil, which is actually a Dravidian language from southern India, which is quite a prestigious minority language. And then there are a whole other range of languages because of the pluralistic nature of Sri Lanka then, but we don't need to go into that. However, at that point in time, the most important language of Sri Lanka is English, the language of the colonial ruler, but not only the language of authority and power, also a very important language of intercultural communication, a so-called link language between the Sinhalese, the Tamils, as well as all those other populations that I just showed you in the previous slide, whether Arabic, Malay, Portuguese Creoles, or others. And crucially, it is a language of very high linguistic capital. It can give you access to desirable professions, to a career in administration, to influential positions of various types. Now, it is important to spend a moment to talk about the dominant minority of Sri Lanka at the time, the Sri Lankan Tamil. Sri Lankan Tamil are an ancient population of Sri Lanka, as ancient as the dominant Sinhalese population. There is so much intermarriage and linguistic and cultural mixture that actually Sri Lankan Tamils and Sinhalese people are genetically indistinguishable and quite removed from the Indian Tamils that live in the Indian subcontinent. In one of the classic acts of colonial rule and of divide and conquer, the British rulers used the Sri Lankan Tamils as intermediaries and as a buffer between themselves and the Sinhalese majority, and gave many of these positions of power and higher education. This is quite different from the situation of the Indian Tamils that are mostly plantation workers and pick tea leaves on plantations still today. Now, what is interesting is that at independence, Sri Lanka was a very pluralist society, a polyethnic society with a whole plethora of religions which coexisted fairly peacefully. And English as a lingua franca supported that multiracial pluralist vision. However, there was a problem, as you often have in post-colonial society. What to do about sovereignty now that the British rulers were going out of the picture? And there were strong advocates for what within the literature of the time is called the Swabhasha movement, the call for self-language rule, meaning the dominant language of the island should not be English, it should not be the language of the colonial power, it should be either Sinhala or Tamil, depending on whom you asked. Now, there were various tendencies within the politics of the time, but what is important to us is to know that the one that prevailed, that was strongly supported by the political elites of the time, that were mostly Western educated Sinhalese and Tamil politicians, was the so-called Sinhala only policy. That was the policy that won because it was felt that only one language was needed to represent the majority of Sri Lanka, and because it was felt that the Sinhalese majority, despite being a majority, was in a position of threat as their language was not valued, as the Tamil minority held positions of powers and authority, and therefore it was necessary to marginalize them from politics and commerce to regain the upper hand. Now, this story that I just told is a classic story of injustice that is often used in movements of nationalism, pointing at minorities and portray them as undeservingly achieving a certain status, or as endangering the delicate, precious majority culture, or portraying the majority as unduly poor versus minorities that seem to have been luckier in the past is not just part of the history of this Sinhala only policy, but it's a classic narrative of a majority of movements of nationalist construction. And language is a very powerful tool to lead these kind of constructions, because it's a tool that connects very closely to identity and to heritage, to things that people can identify and feel very strongly about. Now, the consequence of the Sinhala only policy was, of course, resistance, not just in the Tamil minority, but in political lobbies. There was a political split between the dominant castes, which led to actually a reversal of the Sinhala only policy. And the Sinhala only policy became, and this sounds almost ironic, Sinhala only but Tamil also as an afterthought. Unfortunately, the years that passed between the first declaration and the second language policy did sufficient damage for this to not improve the situation at all. And so it is that we get to the 1960s and the anti-Tamil riots. In 1958, we see the start of an island-wide massacre. And in the first instance, we see around 1,500 deaths. In 1976, the ominous group of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam is created. And you may be familiar with that part of history for which the Tamil Tigers for 25 years conduct a civil war and a civil uprising against the Sinhalese army. In the late 1970s, we see 75,000 victims of racial violence. 5 or so years later, we have 150,000 homeless people. By the time we reach 2009, when the civil war draws to an end, we have up to 80,000 casualties. And during the last month of the year alone, we have about 30,000 deaths among soldiers and civilians as the Tamil Tigers are finally defeated. So these are the consequences of the history line that I just given you. And to just give you a reality check on what this means, because we're just looking at numbers now, I invite you over 1 minute to read the following passage of a well-known composition on the topic. I trust you have had time to read it and to put that image in your mind. And I just want to draw your attention to the line in red, a few questions in gay mood, not to make a mistake, I suppose. This is a direct reference to language. A few questions not to make a mistake, to hear whether they were speakers of Sinhala or Tamil, to know whether they were to be victims or not. And that is, for me, the most chilling part of this, despite the final image. So I want to come to a quicker conclusion than what I thought, because I see that time is running out. Language is an incredibly powerful window on among many other things, the study of identity construction, and in this specific piece of research, nationalism. It allows us to focus on the nexus between language, cultural origins, soul. It allows us to understand how the uniqueness of a certain group is constructed around primarily abstract notions. It teaches us how something like language can be turned from a cultural asset into a weapon for marginalization and for, in this case, social unrest. And because it is so easy to manipulate, stories or fabrications about its delicacy, its weakness, its need of protection can easily help narratives of threat and endangerment to be constructed when they're actually not realistically there. This is obviously not the only thing that linguists can do. And this is not enough. Writing a book or a piece of research on something like this is for me a first step of something that can contribute to make a difference. This is the part that is dissemination of research, but there is much more that needs to be done before any of this is effective. In this specific case, it needs to be turned into language policy documents that policymakers can find accessible and understand. Also, it needs to be turned into educational materials so that the public can actually read and understand these. They should even be turned into co-educational processes so that children find ways to access and understand what it is about. And of course, they should have a social media presence so that they can widely distribute to a number of different audiences. This would be the full plan to try and make a concrete difference through, in this case, my own discipline. And again, for the linguists out there, this is not, I'm not saying that this is the only type of thing that you could do. There are many things that just a discipline like linguistics can do for society. Yes, you can look into social justice and human rights, but you can work with completely different aspects of society. You can, and humanity. You can work with cognition and work in support of psycho, neurological, developmental processes. You can work with history and archaeology, and you can uncover the human past and work with genetics and other things. You can work with educational materials. You can work for preservation of diversity and pluralism. Language, just like any other field of humanities and arts and social sciences, is a powerful window on many, many aspects of society and can really, really make a difference if it is researched and if it is translated in the appropriate way. Now, let me just look at the rest of my slides and chose what to do. Well, actually, I can just run to the end of it. One thing that for me is crucial is escape the discipline. I'm not talking about interdisciplinarity. I can't even tell you what interdisciplinarity is. I'm just saying escape the discipline, because the right questions for me are the questions that exist in society, exist in communities, that are solution-oriented, that are necessarily complex, that must be tackled from different disciplinary backgrounds so that we can get a holistic picture and a powerful message to send out once we have answered the question. So for me, the new humanities and arts and social sciences is a very plugged-in field. It's a field that trains humanists to be active, or activists, if you like, out there for a better good. It roots its research in society. It wants to answer real-world questions. This, for me, is where we can really make a difference in the future. And while we are already doing it in part, I think that the balance between the discipline internal and the theory internal discussion and conversations that we have had, and the plugged-in outward-looking one, needs a readdressing. And that's it for me. Thanks for listening.